Great, thank you. So welcome everyone. I would really like to just welcome our guest, Alexander Galloway, and those joining us online. For those who don't know, I'm Janet Reutman. I'm a professor at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. For those of you who are new to our salon, we are the Platform Economies Research Network. We're basically a network of scholars working on quite various aspects of digital platforms and processes of value production. You can learn more about us. You can go to our website, which is platformeconomies.net. So please do that. And because I'm coming to you from Melbourne, Australia, I'd like to acknowledge that I am a guest on the unceded lands of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I would like to do that especially right now. We just had a referendum in this country. So welcome, Alexander. Brief introduction, because there's a lot to say about Alexander's work. So Alexander Galloway is a professor of media, culture, and communication at New York University. He's a computer programmer as well as a digital media scholar. He has a very long roster of publications, which I could never go through on this in this short introduction. So there is, of course, the most recent book, my very tattered copy, which is the subject of our conversation today, which is Uncomputable, published by Verso in 2021. And amongst the many other publications, I'll just mention a few. My personal favorite, which is Protocol, which was published in 2004. Gaming, Essays on Algorithmic Culture, published in 2006. The Interface Effect in 2012. I have a little list here. And in 2013, in collaboration with Eugene Thacker and the New School's own Mackenzie Wark, Excommunication, 3 Inquiries in Media and Mediation. So I personally learned a lot from this book, Uncomputable. I will hand the mic to you, Alexander, but I first want to take note of the question you asked. It's actually on page 51 of your book, which is, I think, a really interesting question, which is, how did the computer learn to see? And your response is an extremely subtle demonstration. I think that's sort of what this book is. It's a demonstration, which we'll discuss, obviously, today. But if you indulge me, just like literally 1 minute, I want to refer to the first few lines of the introduction. So, excuse me, I'm just going to read this. This book is about the computable and the uncomputable. No general theory. I instead narrate a series of historical episodes. These stories are drawn from the archives of computation and digital media, broadly conceived. The goal is to show how computation emerges or fails to emerge, which I appreciated, how the digital thrives but also atrophies, how networks interconnect while also fraying and falling apart. So wonderful first paragraph. We've asked you to focus on the implications of your work for what Shoshana Zuboff called surveillance capitalism, which everyone's very familiar with. And of course, to speak about computational rendering, which is really the gist of the book. So please take it from here. I will be quiet now. The next 10 to 15 minutes are yours. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Janet. And I appreciate you, reaching out. We had a nice little back and forth, actually over a couple months, kind of conceiving of this. And I could, it's always a pleasure when another scholar, reads your work very closely, and I could tell that you've done that. So, that's a gift. So I appreciate that. So yeah, I'll just give a short little presentation of about 10 minutes. And then I really look forward to the discussion that we can all have together. Now, as a scholar, I frequently focus on the shape of things. What form do things take in the world? And how does form itself tell us something about society, culture, and politics? Now, of course, to some people, let's call them idealists, form tends to uncouple itself from worldly cares. Yet, as a student of Frederick Jameson, at an early age, I learned a rather different lesson. which is that form is not the departure from the social or the political, but in fact, form is the necessary shape in which the political becomes legible. And indeed, the general name for Jameson's own project, kind of lurking in footnotes and other places, is what he has labeled the poetics of social forms. And I think about that a lot, and I often try to mimic his approach, although not nearly with Jameson's level of insight. So I hope our conversation today will pay attention to the shape of things. And in this sense, I'd like to begin with an important book, the one already mentioned, Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, published in 2018. And then bounce off some of my most recent writing contained in the book Uncomputable that Janet already brought up and read from. And by the end, gesture toward an alternative path, that of the scholar Phil Agri, and his important but perhaps not widely read essay on surveillance and capture, which was discussed a little bit in the blog post that circulated. Now, when Zuboff's book appeared, I remember being pleased, but also a bit confused by her use in particular of this word surveillance, a word that perhaps even more so in English than in its French cognate evokes a series of optical and visual operations. Looking over, watching, inspecting, keeping an eye out, as well as operations that aren't necessarily visual, such as monitoring, listening, tracking. And I had already invested a lot of effort over the years in describing computers, frankly, without visual or optical metaphors. So information as bits and bytes, computer networks as rhizomes, maybe a metaphor we could talk about. Code as something you read, like a text, not something you look at, like a picture. And on this point, I, in fact, was in complete agreement with Friedrich Kittler, who almost entirely omitted computers from his comprehensive 1999 lectures on optical media, which are contained in the book of that name. So why did he exclude computers from the history of optical media? Well, Kittler's answer is quite blunt, and I'll read it. The reason is simple. Computers, as they have existed since World War II, are not designed for image processing at all. That's Kittler. Of course, this began to change with the rise of the modern graphics processing unit, or GPU, driven first by overzealous gamers and monopolized today even more so by cryptocurrency mining and machine learning. Nevertheless, Kittler's basic point still holds, I think, that computers are machines for manipulating symbols. And thus, like Kittler, I classify computers as primarily textual machines, or maybe we could say something like symbolic machines. Textual machines, which, yes, happen to be able to process visual data, but only when that data is treated like a text, which it always is, right? There's no pictures inside of a computer. Nevertheless, we are still often caught in a distinctly modern image of power and organization. And I should say for the record, I do think there are important reasons why we hold on to this distinctly modern image, where power is an eye. Power takes the form of Big Brother watching over you. The panopticon prison seems to capture the very architecture of power, even though we know very few panopticons were ever actually built. And so I mentioned Zuboff's book. Here actually are two others just from this month. The Eye of the Master, A Social History of Artificial Intelligence by Matteo Pasquinelli, and Anti-Oculus, A Philosophy of Escape by the Acid Horizon Group. And I should say I haven't read Pasquinelli's book yet. I don't have it yet, but I've read Anti-Oculus and enjoyed it a great deal. But I'm just citing these to note the importance of optical power and the importance of the eye in both of these books. Still, it got me wondering, is the eye the thing? Should we hold on to Big Brother and the panopticon, or do we need something different? And of course, it's almost certainly a kind of both and scenario. Drone cameras aren't going away. You know, Google Maps has forever changed how we envision the surface of the Earth. We're all walking around with smartphones that take pictures at an exceptionally high resolution. In my undergraduate coding class, one of the things we always have to do is downsample the images because they're just too high resolution. So this set me on the journey that would eventually result in this first section of Uncomputable, part of which was pre-circulated to the group. And my intuition was that computers really aren't visual machines. And when they are visual, the form of visuality is radically different from some of the dominant conventions, and perhaps even a little bit kind of, heading in the opposite direction. Okay, you're all probably asking, what do I mean by dominant conventions? This is a controversial term. And I mean a kind of human-centered, or maybe we could even say phenomenological model, in which a perceiving subject is surrounded by a panoramic world, furnishing appearances of itself for us to look at. In 1971, Stanley Cavell wrote a book that I like a lot called The World Viewed: Reflections on the Ontology of Film, that describes these dominant conventions quite well, I think. And of course, they are socially constructed conventions, without question, deeply rooted in a type of modern subjectivity, largely European. And I would also cite the importance of the camera obscura in that history, in that model. So I found this interesting. Looking back into the media history, I found some interesting things. I found that even within European media history, to say nothing of the rest of the world, there exist a number of alternative paths not taken, or paths discovered only to submerge and reappear many years later. And this is the image that you already saw, I think, because this was maybe in the blog post or in one of the chapters that was circulated. This is Francois Willem's photography studio from the 1860s. And I've taken to calling this a reverse panopticon, because the vectors of vision flow inward toward the center rather than radiate outward from the panopticon central guard tower, for instance. And if you look very closely, if you haven't seen it already, I call your attention to the little man sort of hiding on the left in the wall of this circular photography studio, who is an operator of one of 24 cameras that are embedded around the perimeter of this room. So the object of inspection lies at the center, while the focus of power is somehow at the perimeter, maybe even kind of smeared or distributed around the perimeter. I think of this maybe almost as a kind of peripheral vision distributed across 24 discrete cameras, or maybe peripheral vision is a cute, confusing phrase, but something like vision through or in the periphery rather than in the center. There's no real room for this kind of vision within canonical histories of photography or cinema. When I say that, historians of photography and cinema get very upset, but maybe we could talk about it. So this really caught my attention, and I wanted to kind of maybe structure a different sort of media history around this. Now, it was already familiar to me because computers don't really look at scenes from a single point of view. They model all points of view. And it's not just 24, but theoretically a kind of unlimited number of points of view. And I think we can see this in the ubiquitous Hello World demo of computer graphics, which is this, the spinning cube, the ubiquitous spinning cube. And sometimes I tell my students, if we can understand this, we will understand a huge component of what it means to make images in a computer. Now, I guess somewhat ironically, as a kind of visual thinker, I actually often make drawings while I write, using shapes and patterns as tools for thinking. And so in preparing for today, I thought it would be fun to go back into my ephemera file, and I found a series of drawings from when I was working through some of the issues that ended up in the book Uncomputable. And so these are too kind of ad hoc, too messy to make it into the book. So none of these actually made it into the book, but these are some of the forms that I was trying to describe using the admittedly somewhat clumsy language of sort of funnels and horns and cones, these sorts of shapes that I think are in one of the chapters that circulated. So, okay, there's a lot more to say. I should probably just stop here, only to end by reminding you of the kind of two lines of argument that hopefully we can discuss. First, that computers really aren't visual machines, and hence the textual or linguistic forms of capture, and I'm borrowing this stuff from Phil Agree's article, in my mind better describes computation than the visual models of surveillance. So, my response to Zuboff is extremely narrow and pedantic, but I think the point is an important one. I don't disagree, in broad strokes with her political intervention. And second, that when computers do simulate vision, computers are simulation machines, they can simulate anything you want them to simulate. So when they do simulate vision, I think they simulate it in a completely different fashion from the camera obscura, from the phenomenological tradition, from the panopticon, from even, frankly, vanishing point perspective, although computers are very good at adhering to a sort of modern European style of rendering. Nevertheless, I do think we have to carve out a slightly different path from that more dominant narrative that gets told. Okay, so yeah, I look forward to the discussion, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Extremely helpful. In the interest of not having just like a volley of question answer, people who just have a question, just put your hand up just so we know who has questions. Maybe, Alexander, maybe we'll just take like 2 or 3 to see where things, does anybody have something to ask? Unusually shy crowd. Fabio. But I don't want to moderate, so just go for it. Yeah.
Hi, Alexander. This was fantastic and really topical. I'm organizing a roundtable on AI and machine listening that sort of thinks about creativity from an AI perspective versus creativity from a human perspective. And one of the things that came out of a conversation with Joel Stern, who's an artist and curator and has created a sort of a library of AI going crazy, if you want, and sort of trying to think about where the AI can alienate itself in some ways, is that maybe we shouldn't be thinking about creativity as a key aspect of human being. Maybe the key aspect of human beings is the ability of thinking through contradictory things at the same time, whereas a machine sort of has to choose 1 or 0 in some capacity, shape, form. But your argument seems to say the opposite, seems to say that in fact, when computers do simulate vision, they reconstitute vision from a variety of different competing perspectives at the same time. And so I'm just trying to think about that. Is that something that you see as a sort of an alternative explanation to the typical computational story of ultimately a machine has to choose 0 or 1, or is it maybe just simply in the context of thinking about how vision and renditions of vision, subject positions essentially function, that you see that argument working differently?
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I have many questions, but and some are just comments, but actually the one I have that is most related to what Fabio just said is, at some point, I think it's early in the book, you say, and this actually extends the comments you just made, that one single point of view has no meaning. So that's totally counterintuitive, right? Because we assume, we meaning social scientists mostly, this kind of one-to-one correspondence theory of truth, right? Right, so there's a discrete thing, and there's a one-to-one, like and that is situated in a conceptual landscape or something like that. I don't want to elaborate it too much right now, but I personally really appreciated this insight, and I just like to invite you to comment on it, and to comment also on the point that like final vision isn't synthetic. I think this might relate to what Fabio was just saying, right? Final vision isn't synthetic, i.e. it's not a synthesis of multiple points, but it's rather what you call metastable. And that was extremely helpful to me. I mean, I don't want to like, there was something I struggled with. I wrote this very eccentric book on the concept of crisis. And in that book, I sort of was struggling with the idea that value forms produced through computation, and here I'm referring to finance, but they have no meaning. So everyone was like screaming about good and bad when the subprime market failed, but actually these things are just produced by if-then logics, right? So the good and bad is not a production of, the operations themselves, right? Does that sound right to you? And does that sound right or wrong to you? And no irony intended here, but so yeah, so that they're not, they don't have meaning because they're not, good and bad doesn't figure in the operations by which they are produced. Only if-then logics do. That's sort of my point.
Yeah.
I can jump in as well, if that's okay. I've got sort of two things I wanted to sort of bring up. One, actually, I was not going to originally, but it's sort of sparking off something that Fabio just said, which is about that sort of notion of 1 and 0, which I often think ends up getting used much more metaphorically about computers than practically. And it reminded me of this story, since the question that you ask in the book, this question that Janet pointed to as well, which is like, when and how did computers learn to see? And, one story that comes to mind for that, which is a story that Phil Egray would have been very familiar with as well, and that you may well know, which is the story of Marvin Minsky attaching a camera to a computer, one of the first occasions in which that happened, because he and his colleagues imagined that the computer would very easily be able to see what was in the world. It would be very easy to see where the ball is versus the screwdriver or whatever else. And then they were horrified, realizing the messiness of visual data, of just how the ball was not directly, was not obvious within the kind of computational representation they had. And what they thought was the computer would be able to see was not actually seeable at all, precisely because it wasn't really ones and zeros in the way in which they might have imagined it. And since Phil did his PhD at the, in the AI lab at MIT, I'm pretty sure he would have known that. Not that I think those things were of concern to him. So the real question, though, for me is, and it's always when I sort of think about the visual for too long or think about the spatial for too long, which is, where does the temporal go? How is it do we want to think about temporality as sort of part of the kind of surveillance assemblage that the digital can build for us? Because there's one way of thinking about temporality with respect to visuality, and a completely different way that we think about temporality with respect to the kinds of non-visual representations that we get inside computers. So that's my golden apple that I will throw in here.
Thank you, Paul.
I had my hand up, but should we go first with answers?
Yeah.
Do you want to take one more, Alexander? Or?
Do you want to take one more? Or should we do
one? Sure. Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. This was really inspiring. And I've been struggling with Shoshana Zuboff's notion of surveillance for different reasons, mostly how it's been sort of applied to the framing of China as a surveillance state, as sort of a literal, often quite literal translation, but also to frame China as this sort of authoritarian other. But my question was sort of maybe in a similar vein to Paul, that I was very interested in this question of temporality. It seems your provocation drawing from Egray to bring in capture brings to mind sort of historical specificities of what and who is being captured with various forms of technology, and how that was part of colonial projects or projects of domestication, or projects of privatization. So we could think of, Antoine Tresnel's work on animal capture as sort of a prehistory to a Foucauldian panopticon analysis that came to mind, this sort of, how a history of animal capture is prefiguring how contemporary technology is also capturing humans. And so I just wanted to hear your take. So I'm with you on this argument that capture is a much more interesting way to understand power and control with contemporary data structures, sort of the data scientist as sort of a modeler of the world, of data capturing the world, right? But I would love your take on this sort of temporal aspect of colonial history of animal capture, or colonial history of capturing the natives, or does that history of racist othering, do you see that as part of your analysis of capture as a contemporary form of surveillance technology, or an alternative, I guess, as you're proposing to this framing of surveillance? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you all. Those are all very rich and complicated questions. I don't know if I'll be able to do justice to all of them. I've been furiously scribbling notes here. Yeah, I mean, maybe I could just start by stepping back and saying that this was an unusual book for me because I don't typically, I'm not typically sort of rooting around in archives and doing the work of the media historian. And, I'm a maker, I make things, I, write code and interact with artifacts and techne at that level. But my written work tends to be not really in the tradition of like empirical investigations. But this book is different, right? This is my attempt to kind of put don't lead with the theory and philosophy, but actually lead with the artifacts. And maybe, if the book has like some shortcomings, maybe they stem from that kind of me exercising, a different part of the practice that maybe isn't entirely, my primary training or anything like that. But it really was exciting for me to actually try to exhume a series of artifacts. Some of them are, relatively well known. Francois Willem is well known. But there are other things scattered throughout the book that are, in a certain sense, kind of, my own little things that I've maybe not discovered for the first time, but brought to the light of day. So yeah, Fabio's question about sort of choosing a point of view and the problem of synthesis. Janet used this term, the metastable, and I like that. That's good. I am really struggling with how we go from the micro level of the bit and the byte and the discrete element, the pixel, the atom, the integer, how we go from that level to the synthetic level. I think human beings are very good at doing that, and computers are not very good at doing that. And it becomes very messy because oftentimes there's a sort of pathetic fallacy where people, since we're very good at that, will sort of project the synthetic operation or the synthetic event onto the machine. I'm willing to say that there is a moment of synthesis. It might not look like what we're familiar with. So for example, computing an average would be a way that a machine would arrive at some kind of synthesis. Now that sounds very dry and clinical and soulless or something, but yeah, that's kind of the point. Trained AI models are also, in a certain sense, a kind of high dimensional synthesis. That may be a way to talk about that. So yeah, Janet, I'm definitely worried about and don't really have maybe the best answers to trying to manage that relationship between the single index, as you were sort of talking about, and then a multiplexing of indices. I like language of multiplexing. I like language like the parallel rather than the serial. I think in order to get deep into computation, we have to have a sense of parallel sets of things, parallel operations, arrays, lists. And so the parallel, the 24 parallel, now they're not Euclidean, not in Euclidean space parallel in that sense, but they are operating synchronically. And so they each of the 24 cameras, you can think of almost as like a channel or a stream that are not selected in sequence, or there's no kind of montage happening. It's a fully synchronic, not even a fusion, but a coordination of all of these points of view. So yeah, I'm still struggling with the synthesis question because I don't have an obvious answer at almost a technical level for how that happens in a computer. And if I can't see it, then I'm not going to admit that it exists. Now, it exists in humans. We know that, yes. Paul, yeah, I really liked what you said about the kind of messiness of visual data. And I think that's true. We could tell a whole story about sort of like the rocky road that AI researchers had to travel, right? I think the short kind of synopsis that I like to return to for that is, first gen AI was, they thought symbolic logic would do it, right? They thought discrete rationality would do it, and it failed. There was the so-called AI winter in the 1980s, and a lot of people kind of gave up on that. And the reason why AI is so successful today is that they largely gave up on putting discrete rationality at the center of the operation, and they all became social scientists. Basically, they all became empiricists, and they said, no, the tradition of rationalism isn't going to work. We have to become empiricists. We have to let it be data driven. We have to use inductive logic rather than deductive logic. Right? Qualities and traits and behaviors will emerge. They will emerge through emergence. They won't be sort of like deduced through logical syllogism, right? So I think that's maybe another way to kind of think about this sort of problem of like the messiness of the world, the messiness of visual data, and what a computer is able to do when faced with that. And this I find kind of almost dialectical or contradictory, because computers manipulate symbols, but I don't think they really have a symbolic order, if I can use that phrase. They don't really have a symbolic order. There's no, all of the stuff in psychoanalysis, all of the stuff in semiotics and structuralism, I still haven't found any of those things in the computer. So they might be there, or maybe someone has a more kind of enlightened sense of these things. So computers are almost kind of stunted in that sense, meaning they are forced to manipulate symbols, but perhaps they don't really have a symbolic order. Now, again, we do. So in our daily, kind of interaction with machines, being the subject of state power, or any number of other examples, certainly we come up against the law of the father, or we come up against the general equivalent. We come up against the pure abstraction, known as the money form or something like that. The question of time and temporality, which Paul and Silvio, you both brought up. Yeah, I might just plead the fifth on this one, and defer to others in media studies. I'm probably not the right person to say much about time and temporality, mostly because my current investigations into the digital tend to privilege a synchronic / structuralist approach. And I fully understand the shortcomings of structuralism. I fully am totally sober about the fact that we are at like a low point of people's interest in structuralism these days. But I think the material warrants it. So I would plead the fifth and defer to people like Wolfgang Ernst or Mark Hansen, who have written and thought much more extensively about how time and temporality, you know, comes together with the computer. Questions of like microtemporal processes and timescales that are either below or above the threshold of like human attention and affect. Yeah. Okay, we already have three more hands, I guess.
Should I jump in? Was I at first? Or
Yeah,
Michael?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was ready to go on a question, and then you dropped the point on the digital and of course the analog. So I have a question on that, but I'm going to stick with where I was going to go. You know, I kind of thanks so much for joining and sharing your materials. I guess I'm kind of interested in how you understand the audience for this, for your work, and you know, do you see it as part of a broader conversation on the post-visual? And I was thinking, you know, also because we're working with ADM+S, I was thinking of Talfan and Scott Walk's 2021 article. They're building off Paul Gilroy's 1998 article, Race Ends Here. But they're arguing, you know, data science techniques of sorting and classifying servers a non-visual ground for racialization. But, you know, likewise, Wendy Chun's work on correlation, recent work. And then I was thinking just that, you know, work on like against oculocentrism, sound studies in general. Mara, your colleague, Mara Mills, her research on Norbert Wiener's, you know, the hearing glove, which Catherine Howes kind of critiques the hearing glove, but she really takes it back to show how to really reiterate the material interfaces of communication. So to kind of, I guess that goes to your point on the digital and this binary. So that's the first one. How do you kind of see your work more broadly? The second one, and you mentioned paths not taken in your introduction. So a little bit about genealogy. I guess your version of history, as Janet pointed to, your version of history is, you know, where point of view has no meaning. So where computational vision takes it as a given that point of view is not necessary for seeing. And, you know, this would be, maybe in Michael's case as well, but this would be, you know, kind of self-evident for I mean this in a generous way. This would be kind of self-evident for remote sensing scientists and engineers. You know, photogrammetry, geodesy, geophysics, seismology, and the military history that comes with it and kind of continues to generate it. You know, this is all concerned with coordinating multiple points, and these points only have meaning when they're correlated. I guess back to Wendy Chun a little bit, but not necessarily visualized. So the whole practice is about multi-channel correlation. I know you mentioned Kittler, right, and radar. So, but I guess my obvious point is, you know, there are different genealogies, right? There are different paths that we could take to understand computational vision or non-vision in the present. But maybe the other question would be kind of a more science studies question, which would be, you know, history is heterogeneous. There are many paths, but which network has kind of materialized to a greater effect? Like which is more consequential today, let's say, which is producing the social order, not social as a, you know, Durkheim, but so I guess I'm just, you know, for me, right, I'd say the latter because I'm working on the role of the sciences in reinsurance or something. But so it's a methodological point. Like when you're doing this genealogical work, how do you know what to trace and, you know, on what grounds, I guess. That's the hook I could get back to Pern by saying reinsurance more explicitly. I've got another question, but I'll pass it off to whoever. I think Michael.
I think it was Jake actually. So Jake, why don't you go?
Oh, thanks. I'm enjoying this discussion a lot. Thanks, everyone. And I suppose my thoughts are connected to Andrew's in a few ways as well. I'm generally on board with the kind of panopticon bashing that has happened over the last sort of few decades, and I agree in so many ways that it's a clumsy metaphor for digital surveillance and things like that. But there are a few ways that I've found to sort of recuperate its value, both and in one way connected to sort of the visual. And I won't talk about these in any detail, but I really like the work of Jacqueline Miller's Bentham's panoptic machine, where he sort of situates the panopticon within a broader utilitarian calculative apparatus, trying to sort of demonstrate it as a mechanism for making everything productive, for producing an accounting of everything, in order that in sort of Bentham's imagination, a sort of benevolent or philanthropic state can make better choices about how to run society, how to sort of use law to manipulate pleasure and pain. And I think that there is an argument to say that digital surveillance, even to an extent in Zuboff's sort of accounting, is doing this but refracted through perhaps like a different political theology, something like consumer sovereignty. Instead of the in service of philanthropy, we're doing it in service of consumption or something like that. So that's one thing. And then I think about the visual dimension of the panopticon in a lot of ways. And I suppose the question that I can pull out of this comment is to ask whether you've thought about the sort of concept of operational images and the way in which they modulate between the visual and the non-visual. Because, Janet raised this question that your book asks, like, how did computers learn to see? And of course, they don't see, they measure, right? But they measure visual information. So you have this funny thing that's happening, and I'm constantly, in my own work thinking about it, for instance, one form of computer vision, which is facial recognition, and the problems we have with legal regimes that understand images as purely representational and not part of some sort of biometric operation that's happening already through, for instance, the production of image data sets and things like that. So yeah, I suppose out of all of that, my question is, how does like something like operational images help us understand or complicate this question between visual and non-visual?
Hi, Alexander. Thanks. Really great discussion so far, and I'm enjoying the book immensely. I think what I wanted to ask, and so it does pick up on what Jake and Andy were both kind of gesturing at, which I think is to do with these tensions around what a computer does and the language that we deploy, like vision and seeing and so on. And so I kind of wanted to ask you about how you think about computer vision as a kind of mode of capture of things in the world. Like you mentioned, for example, a drone camera, in contrast to like the visual scenes that are reproduced on a computer monitor or a computer screen. Obviously, a huge amount happens computationally in between those 2 points, right, of capture of the world and then representation for human comprehension as a visual scene, rather than like, all the code, the symbolic code. And I was thinking about this in part because, like, I've been working on drone technologies in various ways for a while now, and there's this real challenge because that optical metaphor dominates in that space as well. And there's been some great work to push back against that. But one of the challenges there is that like drones are proposed as optical, but of course there's no optics there in the sense of like glass lenses or anything like that are doing like optical capture. It's all immediately caught on digital sensors and so on. But also what's being captured is not just optical spectrum, but multiple spectrums, thermal imaging and so on. And so the capture there is like immediately something that is like not perceptible to a human perceiving subject at all. So I'm wondering about like this point of entry of like the computer seeing something in the world, but also then like the representation of that. And so is vision the same in both of those ways? Is what the computer's doing the same, I guess? And I guess, you know, I was going to sort of ask where sort of Jake got to, which is like, does the computer see it all? And is that actually part of the problem, is that we say that computers see?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I could just respond, you know, maybe a word like sensing is better, right? I think you just said perceiving, sensing. And you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, thermal imaging, multiple spectrums. I'm very sensitive to the multiple interfaces that devices will have. So even, I mean, even, you know, the humble smartphone, it would take us a long time to actually itemize all of the interfaces, right? I mean, there's a you know, GPS interface, there's a Wi-Fi interface, there's a screen interface on the front, there's often more than one camera, you know, working in a visual spectrum, non-visual spectrum, not to mention power interfaces, all these things. So yeah, maybe an attention to the multiplicity of interfaces and thinking of them in terms of sensing rather than seeing. I don't know, maybe. And I love the first thing that you got at, sort of like the sort of like modeling of the world, let's just say in the computer's memory or something, or on disk, versus the like render that hits your screen, right? And you didn't quite put it this way, but I think this is what you're getting at. It's almost like kind of the last mile problem again, you know, but it's sort of just immediately within this very tight loop where we have this kind of fully rendered suspended space that then, oh, you poor human, you need a render, you know, you need it to be in a rectangle on a screen. And so we'll do that for you at the last second. And I think that's true. You know, we do have screens, we need screens, we use screens all day long, but provided, you know, we can admit that, provided we know that that is only a kind of epiphenomenon, I would claim, of, you know, of something, you know, that looks a lot more like this, right? That is a model, right? That contains XYZ coordinates in a text file. And that's not how we think of pictures or worlds. I don't think. Okay, so many interesting other things to get back to. Andrew, the question of sort of who is the audience, by which I guess I'm kind of interpreting that as almost like who do I find affinity with? Is that kind of what you were getting at? Sorting in class.
I guess so. Yeah.
I mean, I should admit just freely, and this does get me into trouble sometimes in my part of academia, but I really just got sick of the kinds of narratives, and maybe this is a straw man, it's just like too easy to put this aside, but I was seeing it a lot, you know, the kind of straw man that says, well, how do we understand the computer? Well, it's just the latest entry in this grand, you know, media parade that began with photography and then went to cinema, and then the computer is just kind of like interactive cinema or something like that, right? And so those are the kind of media histories that I wanted to just kind of put to the side and say, like, nope, we have to find a different lineage. You know, maybe finding lineages is a stupid thing to do, but if we want to do that, I think it's got to be a different one. You mentioned a bunch of work that I'm absolutely drawn to and inspired by. Certainly Wendy Chun's work, that I've been engaging with her work for a very long time. I like her recent book, Discriminating Data, and wrote a review of it. The political question, that's a big, tough one. It kind of goes back to Sylvia's question too about the colonial history of capture, who is being captured. That would require a much longer conversation. Let me just say one thing, and it kind of brings in the book Protocol that Janet also mentioned at the top too. which is that for better or worse, you know, I'm fairly invested in a certain kind of political conversation that tries to understand a shift in the, to go back to shape, a kind of shift in the form or shape of power and organization that shifts away from power as it's understood through hierarchical, pyramid-shaped and centralized models toward an understanding of power and organization that is inherently distributed, is inherently deterritorializing rather than territorializing, is inherently you know, focused on process and becoming and historical evolution. And I'm not sure I have any like really good answers to that, but my basic intuition, and it's not a hard and fast rule, right? We have, whenever you periodize, of course, all periods are somewhat co-present in different proportions. But I felt that that there was a, particularly in digital studies, oh boy, man, in the 90s, everyone thought that openness and distribution and rhizomatics and horizontality and, you know, all of those things were just unvarnished, you know, that these were just sort of like pure, innocent political goods. And I think, you know, by now, certainly, I think very few people would say that, although what's his name just posted a new manifesto that's all about openness and growth and all of these things. Is his name Chris Anderson? Is that his name? So yeah, I know that's maybe not a satisfying answer, but that is my answer, that I'm kind of in that tradition of saying, well, you know, distribution, horizontality, superficiality, affect rather than feeling, you know, distribution rather than centralization. These are all of the domains that we have to write a clear, detailed history of in terms of power and organization. Those aren't the way we escape power and organization. They have their own distinct form of it. Jake, yeah, I assume by operational images you're referring to UC Parika's recent book. Yeah, I'm a huge fan. I think that's exactly the kind of approach that is important. I'm thinking of also of someone like Trevor Paglen, the artist. Some loud music outside my office. Trevor Paglen, who's also an eloquent writer, and he wrote an essay, what's it called? Images Are Watching You or something like that, which now is actually a few years old, that he wrote relatively early in the kind of contemporary chapter of adoption of AI. And it's in spirit, it's very similar to the notion of operational images, right? Like the idea is that an image is not primarily pictorial or even primarily visual, but has, what can we say, mechanical uses, right? So a great example is what's it called, like what's the name for it, like a pixel bug or something, where a spammer will send you an email and then include an image in the bottom of the email, but the image is just a clear pixel, right? So you cannot see it. But if your email loads on your computer, the spammer's server has to get pinged in order to load that image. So it's a way to sort of remote track individuals. And so I think that's a really good example of an image that really doesn't have any visual or pictorial value, but does have an operational or machinic value in terms of tracking and establishing links, right? Establishing networked relationships. Yeah, great. And then, yeah, Michael, I guess I already got to some of the things that you were talking about. Yeah, so thanks again to everyone. Yeah, Na?
Yes,
Yeah.
and thank you so much for the great talk and discussion. I'm thinking coming from a design perspective and referring to the concept of aura and which creation of art and and especially in the design industry. And there's a process of creation with computational technology, where we build our 3D model and buildings inside of the computers, and before actually building is built, and to making what is going to be looking like in the future. And so there's an interactive process between creation of art, and that kind of aura is not resonate in one moment or one place, but actually it is a continuous and almost fragmented process in creation. And also looking at now social media and all those image is transpassed and being edited along the spread of the information and the image. I'm just thinking how you see that kind of interactions happen, and how you feel about it. Thank you.
And are you an architect, or you have a different relationship to design?
I used to be, I was architect before, but now I'm thank you.
Yeah. And you said aura. Did I hear you right? You said aura?
Yeah, referring to Walter Benjamin. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to bring that concept back. You know, I feel like I mean, when I was in graduate school, that Walter Benjamin article was sort of like one of about 5 or 6 articles that, you know, everyone had to read, right? It was like Cyborg Manifesto, you know. And I think it's a pity that I think many people are sort of too cynical and jaded to want to embrace a concept like aura, but maybe we need to do that. That seems to be fairly incompatible with the sort of cyber culture that we all swim inside of today. So I like that. And you're absolutely right. The I don't know if you use this word, but maybe we could add it, iteration, right? Like the iterative nature of design practice, where you know, make a prototype, demo it, iterate again, make a new prototype, demo it, iterate again. And absolutely, you know, that's sort of part of the kind of ethos of design. I also think it has very good practical outcomes, meaning like you're never going to make a good object or a good work of art or a good building if you don't go through that kind of iterative process. And I mean this in just a very simple pedagogical level. One of the things I like about thinking about design and architecture today is the persistence of technical artifacts. It's just that our kind of palette of artifacts is now different and new and weird. And so I'm sure you all have seen, what could we call them, kind of like wireframe model buildings, right? Where you see some fancy new Starchitect building, and you can just see the CAD software, like you can just see the rendering techniques, right? Sometimes it's very lazy and sloppy, where you can tell that they just, you know, made some kind of thing, stretched it, warped it a few times, and then just, you know, sent it to the service desk to be manufactured, or something like that. So yeah, that's maybe a kind of I don't know, casual or sort of like incidental observation, but I think about those kinds of issues as well, and how using CAD or using modeling software opens up a lot of things, absolutely, but it also of course, like any medium, has its own strictures and kind of I don't know, axiomatic foundations that then can reappear in the built. Yeah, and if we can have continuously iterative buildings, that's a hard thing to pull off. I guess that's been a kind of fantasy of architects for a long time, right? You know, there's always these fantasies like the building that walks. You know, that's a recurring fantasy. And I think the building that's constantly morphing is also a recurring fantasy that maybe has been realized in certain ways. Yeah, Janet?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I feel like there's so much going on, so in a good way. I guess I want to just return actually to something you said in response to somebody. I've lost the thread here. Well, one, just to come back to my prior comment, which was this issue of like good and bad versus if then. So the comment you made earlier about like there is no like the computer, if we can say that even now, has no symbolic order. I think that's extremely important. I think that relates to sort of why not Zuboff, but the way Zuboff has been carried forward in critique troubles me. And so if there's no symbolic order, there's no sort of intrinsic values, i.e. good, bad, being produced, right? Operationally, or representationally even, I guess. I don't know if I could say that. Anyway, but I'd like to link that to what you said about the fact, which I share, that you don't lead with theory, you lead with artifacts. I mean, in my work, I have to do that very differently. But I think that's really, really important. And I guess I would just invite you to say something about method. Actually, in the book, this is what you call algorithmic reenactment. So this is sort of like a reverse engineering. And I'm saying this because I really appreciate that this method is, and you say this in the book, a project of discovery. I think that's just so important in our work. And the big slabs of theory have sort of, we've lost, experimentation and projects of discovery. I personally think that actor network without the theory on the end has that potential. I think it relates to what Andy said about, demonstrating when a network becomes more consequential, i.e. when it stabilizes. So I would love it if you could just say something about how what you've done is not text-based work, how it doesn't involve like merely consulting publications and archives, but is rather a computational research method. I have another thing I'd like to say, but it's a little bit long. Should I just go ahead? Are you?
Well, let me address that now or speak to that, and then we can go back to you, Jenna, because I thank you for bringing that up, because this is a nice opportunity for me to sort of describe what's going on in the book Uncomputable in a kind of broader frame. And yeah, you mentioned this method of algorithmic reenactment. So just for the benefit of the whole group, it's like I said, it's an unusual book for me. It's structured around making things and building things. So it's the opening conceit is sort of finding something in the archive that has an algorithmic or digital facet to it in some way. And I try to cast the net very broadly. So I'm not constraining myself to when the World Wide Web was invented, or I'm not even constraining myself to personal computing, not constraining myself to cybernetics and post World War II era. I'm thinking extremely broadly. And so the book is structured around three primary examples of making things. And so the first one that appears is actually textile. So it pertains to a kind of lesser known weaver who was working in the 40s and 50s, who used algebra, in fact, who used algebraic sort of techniques to create these very sophisticated patterns. And so my, I guess, quixotic folly was to learn how to weave and to actually recreate these textiles. I had to, speaking of iteration, I had to do it a few times to actually get it right. The second one is actually the image that appears on the front and the back of the book, which is an instance of cellular automata. So again, I found a white paper from this unusual mathematician from the early 1950s who was working on one of the early computers the electronic computer at the Institute for Advanced Study, which was John von Neumann's computer. And I got the white paper, and he explains how he did it on this early digital computer, and so I was able to recreate that algorithm and get it running just in a simple processing sketch. And then the kind of big white whale for me at the end that sort of ends the book pertains to, of all people, the French situationist Guy Debord, who, unknown to me at the time, late in life, did a kind of retirement project, which is that he made a tabletop game that's sort of similar to chess. And so over the last few years, I was able to just report that game to the computer. You can actually play it on your iOS or Mac OS device, which is my kind of like ultimate revenge. Back sort of aimed at Debord. But and so the assumption here is that, and maybe this is kind of what Na was getting at too, is that there's certain things you can't learn unless you have a kind of intimate manual relationship to the artifact. I know that to be true. So there's things in this book that I never would have discovered, very practical, direct things, if I hadn't actually built these things and made these things from the ground up. So that's what I'm putting under this kind of clunky heading of algorithmic reenactment. I know that that's maybe not the right phrase. Reenactment has a very specific meaning within the art world, and I'm not trying to necessarily connect it to that. I think, Janet, you said reverse engineering. Yeah, that's certainly the spirit of it. Restaging, maybe. Oftentimes it entails a kind of fiduciary, almost curatorial relationship to the source work, where you're obligated to migrate it into a new format and to insinuate certain interpretive steps, right? Which aren't exact facsimiles of the original, in order for all sorts of reasons, right? In order for it to actually just be legible on a screen, or so that's part of the process of what creates the identity of this book, and that might not be entirely obvious from the outside. Yeah. Okay, back to you, Janet.
Thank you. Actually, I think reenactment is perfectly fine. Sorry. No matter what, I don't know if that's what I've just said, something terrible or not, but
I like the emphasis on action and enactment, because computers really are ergodic machines, meaning they enact things, they enact a form of work. Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah. Anyway, I'm thinking through this. I'm actually, so on that point, even, I guess, because this group, when it first formed, was struggling with that problem of, well, we can't just do text-based. And unfortunately, I don't, I'm not a computer programmer, so I don't have the affordances that you have. But I guess then my next comment kind of brings us closer to some of the things that this group has been discussing over the last however many 5 years or something, is and actually it relates to the distinction you make via Agre between surveillance on the one hand and capture on the other. So panopticon is the wrong metaphor. Your point that, so I'm just rehearsing this for the sake maybe of also people listening who haven't read the book, but so the computer isn't a surveillance machine in like the narrow sense, not characterized by centralization. So this was really helpful to me. I know that seems like, after this conversation, a simple point, but it really kind of got me thinking. And especially I was really interested, or still am, in the point that the computer is best characterized as a reverse panopticon, right? Based on decentralization and distribution, right? So we can say, or you say this, right, that what is at stake for computational rendering is not the integrity of the object, but the perspectival construction of the object, right? Which I think we've been talking about this, right? So this might seem like totally far-fetched, right? I'm sort of want to do this, but I personally think that this is actually a really good way of thinking about digital financial assets and forms of value. And I would love to hear what others think. Keen, not putting you on the spot here, but maybe I am. So you got me thinking that we could even talk about renderings of financial assets. And I'm not saying this just to be cute, right? Like I'm actually trying to think through this because we think of financial assets, like, for example, securities, or derivatives as these closed off things, right? That's the integrity of the object. When in fact, they are constitutively relational. They emerge in contracts, like that's what a derivative is. They constitute debt relations, right? And they're distributed, right? Especially via computational processes, but even sort of beyond that. So like, I don't have a question, but I would love to hear what anybody else, does that sound crazy? Or does that sound like, feasible? Like, does that sound helpful? I guess my question is whether that is analytically helpful. So I think it is to me, and my great surprise when I read your book was like, I have nothing to do with anything that you write about, but I was actually like, wow, this is like really, I can really relate to this, and it's extremely helpful conceptually. So yeah, I'll stop there. Anybody? Or Alexander, if you, because that, I don't want to make you talk about financial assets, but
I mean,
actually,
I don't know anything about money, so I can't, or finance, so I can't talk about that. But it does make sense to me, particularly when you said that these have to be defined relationally, and maybe it's relationally like in a pretty massive scale, I would imagine. Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, yeah, maybe just to reiterate that sort of logic of the kind of many to one, right? Where the power is almost like or the instigating momentum is in the many, in the sight of the many. And then the one becomes kind of like the focalizing object of attention. And so, if we go back to if we go back to the Francois Willem example, you have this kind of like, what is being produced? Well, what's being produced is at the center of this architectural space. We could even take an everyday example of something like Wikipedia, right? It's sort of like the last thing from Web 1.0 that hasn't been like completely turned to shit. But even there, you have this sort of like many to one focalizing. I mean, in terms of authorship and collective authorship. And certainly AI, like training AI models, works in a very similar way, where you would begin with a massively large database of measurements, essentially, that constitute the training data, that then in machine learning, become focalized into this kind of highly distilled trained model. And you can think of this in extremely straightforward and literal sense. How big is the training data? Well, it could be gigabytes, even bigger, terabytes, massive. How big is the trained model? Well, it might be only a few megs, right? It might be only 10 or 20 megs. And so how do you go from this massive relational set of measurements and kind of focus and distill and funnel them into this certainly highly dimensionally like vivid, but nevertheless condensed, focused, kind of sculpted, trained model. So I don't know if those two examples are helpful, but I think the logic is very similar. It's the kind of funnel logic where the instigating powerful agent is sort of smeared or distributed across the periphery, as opposed to being this kind of condensed, powerful sovereign subject like Big Brother.
Exactly. I mean, that is sort of what the reason why I kind of raise this. One is just like how, like the question I raised, like how we conceptualize financial artifacts, to use your language. But I guess the other thing, and this does, sorry to continue with my obsession with crisis, but that was sort of my frustration with the critique and political judgment of what happened with the subprime mortgage market for derivatives, let's just say derivatives and securities, was that if you think of them as these discrete objects, right, we end up with this functionalist understanding of them. Right? These discrete objects go into the world and they do this, then they do that, and so it's a completely instrumental rationality understanding of the way they function, which I actually am not sure that that's how they function, right? And I think the distributed nature of them really is like, so our critique is wrongheaded, right?
And
like,
I wonder if
yeah,
you
there's
could,
like finance, which is this thing that creates these artifacts, and then we understand them through this instrumental rationality as discrete objects that go into the world and do these one or two things, when in fact, right? So I'm all for the critique, but I just think the critique was fucking wrong, you know, so excuse my language, but
and what,
so,
Janet, what do you make of sort of like volatility and contingency, right? Because those seem to be absolutely central to how we
they are,
have to understand finance.
Right, but this is, I mean, I can see Andy's about to jump out of his seat there, but one thing is that, and I, you know, hats off to Martha Poon, who is not on this call, who I'm constantly giving credit to, is that there's an idea that risk is out there and it's bad. Volatility is out there, it's bad. When in fact, if you're in finance, you're all for producing volatility because you need arbitrage, you need the spread, right? And same with risk, because you need to price risk. So you're actually, the engineering of finance, if we can call it that for shorthand, is all about producing more risk and producing volatility, right? So the critique is completely wrong-headed, right? Yeah, sorry, Andy, did you want to?
Well, I was just going to kind of flip it back to Alexander here, because, you know, Janet, you're kind of making this point about the discreteness of objects and financial services and products. But I guess, you know, how does that work? I guess what's your commitment, Alexander, there to like the digital, right? The discrete and the binary with, I mean, I think you know where I'm going with this question. And I think I actually asked you this question a few years ago at the New School, but you know, what is your commitment to that binary there? Because it seems like, I mean, maybe it's not apparent, but Janet's kind of arguing for maybe a more of a, in your terms, like more of an analogic approach, right, to finance. But like you seem very committed to upholding the digital, right? And you understand the digital in digital terms. So yeah, what's your commitment to it? Is there a middle ground, which I think is maybe, I'm just trying to find a way between you and Janet. Is there a middle ground between the analog and the digital? Is there continuity in the digital? You know, from my, you know, readings in grad school, right? Like the analog was suppressed, right, in 20th century early cybernetics. But do you feel like you're suppressing it too? And if you are, then what are the stakes in doing that? Which is really my main question there.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, guilty as charged. I don't think suppression is the right word, though, because frankly, you know, I wrote an article called The Golden Age of Analog that tries to make the case that, in fact, the dominant discourse today is an analog discourse. And so you're exactly right. I would adopt the label that you just suggested, that I'm trying to do a, as it were, digital theory of the digital. I think that's exactly true. That's why I made reference earlier to structuralism, and why, I'm forced at gunpoint to return to structuralism, and I'm doing that really on principle, frankly, not because I think structuralism is better than something else, or that I think the digital is better than something else, but I think that is the kind of high watermark, at least in the 20th century, of people of sophisticated work on all of the things that the digital evokes, namely code, symbol, number, text, logic, all that stuff. But the first part of what you said is super interesting as well, randomness and noise. Yes, I agree with you. I guess with the kind of gist of what you were getting at, which is that if we ask a question about, let's say, arbitrage, volatility, contingency in a kind of narrow textbook sense, those things are excluded from computation and they're excluded from digitality. This is the narrow sense, and I'll make it slightly more complex in a sense, right? Like in a second. Computers can't generate random numbers unless they are given a nice little crutch from certain kinds of much more unpredictable inputs, right? So we can get pseudo-random numbers. There's some pretty nice tricks that people figured out over the years. But randomness and noise, they're in the machine, right? We have to deal with fluctuating voltages that don't look too tidy, and they have to get cleaned up and clipped and cropped and all those things. But once we get into a digital space, there's really not a lot of room for all those things. The way to make the answer slightly more complex is to roll back in history to those pivotal years, 1947, 1948, where we have figures like Norbert Wiener and Claude Shannon. Okay, so we'll start with Norbert Wiener. Norbert Wiener, for him, what is noise? Well, it's a scary thing that's going to degrade your signal, right? So noise is something that needs to be avoided. Shannon also was aware of this, but Shannon's sense of information is much more sophisticated, because Shannon, in his famous information theory, basically says, no, the signal has to be mathematically defined in terms of the size or the gamut of unpredictability, i.e. the kind of entropic gamut of what is possible within a certain mode of speaking, a certain language, a certain like encoding basis or something like that. And so this is like totally perverse and interesting and cool. And I think the Shannon tradition is the one to follow, because it's the one that says, we're told that noise is systematically excluded from digitality in the machine, but in fact, it is totally folded in this other much more kind of central, almost structural sense, right? And we see it all over the place. Like, you can't play a video game that hasn't used, Perlin noise or some sort of procedural noise to render textures, landscapes, behaviors, all sorts of things. You've probably never looked at an image in your life that hasn't benefited from anti-aliasing, right? Which is a way to sort of introduce unpredictable elements that soften transitions within the image. So there are a lot of examples where we have sort of like random noise contingent things that are brought back into the machine. And I think it's really that Shannon tradition that is the best way to remember that.
I wondered if we come back a little to some of what Janet was talking about, because I was thinking, Janet, as you were posing that question, and then Alexandra, as you were responding to, I was thinking about high frequency trading and automated stock trading, particularly around derivatives. And there's a really, I'm sure the technology's moved on a little bit now, but there's a really terrific Donald McKenzie essay about this. I think it was in London Review of Books, but the way high frequency trading worked, at least at that point, I'm sure it's pretty similar now, is that there's an attempt to capture volatility, right? And to capture volatility before it arrives at the market. So, and this is where we get into this like sort of material spatial relation between like computation, sensing, processing, etc. Because what these high frequency trading firms would do is they would try to find real estate where along the signal path from Chicago, where the derivatives markets are, to New York, where most of the trading takes place, and try and capture the interval, right? The like fractional speed at which something is processed over here and then moves over there and then is acted upon by traders. And so you would be attempting to like arbitrage that volatility with like millions and millions or thousands of very small transactions that where you're trying to capture like tiny differences in in cents per derivative or whatever it might be. And it's the accumulation of like huge numbers of trades and a incremental capturing of value over time. But it was interesting to me because of that, this like this connection between like the material distance, like material space, the distribution of like of these servers and sensors and stuff on a line, like in a place in America, right? But then also this like to doing it in order to really perceive the future before the future is there, and to be able to act upon the future before it becomes the present. And so there's this sort of like interesting thing, I think, about this relationship between like sensing, value capture, and space and time that goes on in that type of trading, that high frequency trading. And one of the sort of interesting phenomena about it is that even though it's like purportedly extremely automated, the firms themselves have humans acting to like watch the machines, because these like high frequency algorithms can also crash markets really fast by making mistakes, you know, like noise in the system, I guess, to pick up on where you just were. And so like, you know, again, we come back to like this problem of where the limits of the computational sensing and processing sits, and where there's need for human intervention and whatever. Sorry, bit of a tangent from the conversation.
No, actually, it's very related. You reminded me, that's a great piece, which actually Don McKenzie presented at the New School at some point. But yeah, I wrote that down because I feel like this conversation has inspired me to think about some things that maybe will come in writing. Alexander, I don't know if you have any comments on that point. The Don McKenzie article is amazing. But welcoming you to have kind of a last word here. So
yeah, I'm not very well versed in finance stuff, although I do find it fascinating. I guess my question, I don't know, I'm kind of sour on a lot of this stuff, because I wonder, I wonder what's really happening there in the sort of arbitrage stuff, right? Like, is it shouldn't value production be better than that or something, right? Like, are we really just limited to some kind of like extremely impoverished, like kind of sort of one-upsmanship at the level of like the agitation of the universe or something, right? Like, and who's agitating that universe to begin with, to the extent that finance even has any relationship to, the mode of production or something. So that's one of the reasons why why over the years it's hard for me to really engage with money and finance, because it does seem so abstract and so kind of so uncoupled.
But I think one of the things, sorry, not to open a whole new conversation, but the consequences of not just Don McKenzie's writing, but a whole kind of, group or genre, to Michael's point, is that he's really interested in the materiality, where it's very coupled to the mode of production. I mean, these firms moved to New Jersey and like, anyway, I'm not going to get into it because it's in his piece, but I think that actually is sort of part of what he's trying to get at, is not, it's actually, we think it's uncoupled, but it's actually not as uncoupled as we think. But the agitation part and the sad, sorry way that we produce value. I mean, yeah. And
this is the Donald McKenzie of the engine, not a camera, right?
That's right.
Because that to me is just, it's such a like, I know that book is about something completely different, but even just that phrase, the engine, not a camera, is like exactly what we've been talking about this whole time,
That's right.
Moving away from the legacy of the camera obscura, or this sort of traditional idea of like an image or a representation, and thinking instead in terms of operations, engines, devices, mechanical operations that are producing, I don't know, outcomes that don't really look like pictures. Yeah,
absolutely. I would not have made that connection, but that is absolutely right. And actually, I think that's a really good place to end, wrapping it all up and bringing it back to finance as one does. Thank you so much, Alexander. This was an incredibly rich conversation. Thanks for fielding all of our wide-ranging questions. Very brave of you. For those, I don't know who's online here, but we just stay tuned. We're doing a conference in New York City, in fact, in April. I guess that's 2024, isn't it? So there'll be information about that on the website. Alexander, please stay in touch. Everyone in Melbourne or Australia, have a good day. Sydney, and everyone in the States, have a good evening.
Great.
So,
Thank you, Janet,
yeah.
for putting
Thanks so
this together. I
much.
really appreciate it. It's been a
Yeah.
great conversation.
Totally. Yeah. Thanks. Bye.